She was a wild child he had to tame until she stirred his hidden desire. She'd come to his door wearing defiance-like armor, expecting a prison. But Hart Fisher had other plans, and somewhere between his ultimatum and her rebellion, the line between captor and captive blurred until neither could remember who was supposed to break first. Welcome, my beloved. Before we dive into the whole story, please click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as beautiful as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let's get into it. The carriage wheels crunched over gravel like bones breaking, and Haley Fox pressed her face against the window, watching her future rise from the Virginia countryside. 3 stories of weathered stone and secrets, wrapped in ivy that looked less like decoration and more like the land itself trying to pull the building back into the earth where it belonged. She'd worn her worst dress on purpose, the green one with the frayed hem that made her look like she'd been dragged backward through a hedge. If Hart Fisher wanted a niece he could parade before society, he'd have to work for it. The driver opened her door and Haley stepped down without waiting for assistance. Her boots hit mud instead of the stone path, splashing brown across her already questionable hemline. Perfect. Miss Fox. The voice came from the doorway, deep and measured. Hart Fisher stood backlit by the entrance hall, tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the frame. He wore black like he was attending a funeral, perhaps her independence's, she thought darkly. Uncle. She didn't curtsy, didn't smile, just stood there in the mud with her chin raised and waited to see what he'd do about it. He descended the steps with the kind of unhurried grace that suggested he'd never been rushed in his life. Up close, he was younger than she'd imagined from his letters. 45 looked different when it came wrapped in sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of smoke. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, something his carefully worded correspondence had failed to mention. "You're shorter than I expected," he said. "You're ruder than I hoped." Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, but close enough to be dangerous. "We're going to get along splendidly, or destroy each other trying." He gestured toward her trunk, still strapped to the back of the carriage. "Is that everything you own?" "Everything worth keeping." "Then you travel light. I admire efficiency." He turned and walked back toward the house, clearly expecting her to follow. "Mrs. Carmody will show you to your rooms. Dinner is at 7. Don't be late." "I'm always late," Haley called after him. "It's one of my most developed talents." He paused at the threshold, glanced back over his shoulder. "Then I suppose we'll eat cold food." "I don't repeat myself, Miss Fox. And I don't wait." The door closed behind him with a sound like a judge's gavel. Haley stood alone in the yard, mud seeping into her boots, and felt the first real flutter of uncertainty since accepting his offer. She'd expected shouting, rules, threats. Not this cool assessment, this sense that she was being measured against some invisible standard and found... what? Lacking? Interesting? Dangerous? A woman appeared in the doorway, Mrs. Carmody, presumably, round-faced and sharp-eyed, with the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen everything twice and hadn't been impressed either time. "Your room's ready, miss. 3rd floor, east wing. Lovely view of the gardens, if you're the sort who cares about that kind of thing." "I'm not." "Good. Then you won't be disappointed when you realize it's mostly weeds and dead things this time of year." Mrs. Carmody collected her trunk with surprising strength. "Word of advice, miss? The master's not what he seems. Most folks never figure that out. Those who do usually wish they hadn't." Haley followed her inside, into a hall that smelled of old wood and older secrets. Portraits lined the walls, severe-looking men and women in outdated fashions, all with the same sharp features and calculating eyes. The Fisher family, she assumed. Her family, technically, though they looked like they'd rather die than claim kinship with someone who showed up in a mud-splattered dress. The feeling was mutual. Her room was at the top of 3 flights of stairs that left her breathless. Large, yes. Well-appointed, certainly. But there was something off about it. The way the window faced away from the main drive, the heavy lock on the outside of the door that Mrs. Carmody pretended not to notice when Haley pointed at it. "Just an old feature," the housekeeper said quickly. "These rooms used to be nurseries. The locks were for keeping children safe, you understand." Or keeping them in, Haley thought, but didn't say. Haley arrived at dinner precisely 15 minutes late, wearing the same mud-stained dress. She'd debated changing. There were 3 perfectly acceptable gowns hanging in the wardrobe that hadn't been there when she'd first entered the room, but spite was a powerful motivator. Hart sat at the head of an absurdly long table, reading a leather-bound book by candlelight. He didn't look up when she entered, didn't acknowledge her presence at all until she'd made it halfway down the table's length. "The seat at the end, if you please." His voice carried the kind of boredom usually reserved for discussing weather. "I prefer to see who I'm dining with." "How democratic of you. Most tyrants keep their prisoners out of sight." "Most prisoners don't show up wearing the evidence of their rebellion quite so literally." He finally looked up, and his gaze traveled from her muddy boots to her deliberately mussed hair. "Though I'll admit, it's a bold choice. Calculated defiance or genuine lack of care. Does it matter?" "Everything matters, Miss Fox. Haven't you learned that yet?" He closed his book with a soft thump. "Your father certainly never did. He thought consequences were things that happened to other people, right up until the debt collectors came calling." The words hit like a slap. Haley felt her face heat, her hands curling into fists beneath the table. "You didn't know him." "I knew him better than you think. We were business associates once before he decided speculation was more exciting than strategy. I tried to warn him." Hart poured wine into 2 glasses with steady hands. "He didn't listen. Foxes rarely do. They're too busy being clever to notice when they've outsmarted themselves into a trap." "And Fishers? What are they too busy doing?" "Surviving." He slid 1 glass down the table toward her with practiced precision. It stopped exactly at her place setting. "Your father was brilliant, Miss Fox. Charming, quick-witted, absolutely magnetic. He was also reckless, prideful, and entirely convinced that rules were for lesser men. You're very much like him." "You say that like it's a bad thing." "It got him killed." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Haley stared at her plate, at the untouched food that Mrs. Carmody had apparently laid out before disappearing into whatever shadows housekeepers disappeared into. Her father's death hadn't been dramatic, just a fever that wouldn't break, made worse by stress and whiskey and the kind of despair that comes from watching everything you've built crumble to dust. "I'm not here to break you," Hart said quietly, and something in his tone made her look up. "Despite what you might think, I'm here to keep you from breaking yourself." How noble. "And I suppose the only way to save me is to turn me into someone I'm not, someone manageable and meek and desperate for society's approval. I'm going to turn you into someone who survives." He lifted his glass. "There's a difference." Haley grabbed her own glass and drank deeply, not caring that ladies were supposed to sip. The wine was excellent, which annoyed her. Everything about this place was excellent in that infuriating way that made rebellion feel petty rather than powerful. "I have rules," Hart continued. "You may find them restrictive. You will definitely find them non-negotiable. You'll rise at a reasonable hour. You'll take your meals in company, not hidden away in your room. You'll learn the skills necessary for a woman of your station. Not because I care about needlework, but because the world you're re-entering does. And you'll remember every single day that this house is your sanctuary only as long as you respect it as such. And if I don't, then you're free to leave. I'm not keeping you prisoner, Haley." The use of her first name startled her. "The door is right there. The question is, where exactly would you go?" He had her there, and they both knew it. No money, no prospects, no family, besides the uncle currently dissecting her with his storm cloud eyes. She could feel the trap closing, could sense the walls narrowing even as he pretended to offer her freedom. "I'll stay," she said finally. "For now." "How generous of you." Hart returned to his meal, the conversation apparently over. But halfway through the main course, he spoke again, softer this time. "Your room, the lock on the outside. Mrs. Carmody will remove it tomorrow." Haley's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Why?" "Because you're not a child who needs containing. You're a woman who needs choices." He met her eyes across the impossible distance of that ridiculous table. "Even if you make the wrong ones." The rain came 3 days later, turning the grounds into a watercolor painting of grays and greens. Haley spent the morning in the library, ostensibly practicing her watercolors as Hart had insisted, but actually reading a scandalous French novel she'd found hidden behind a dusty collection of sermons. She was so absorbed in a particularly heated scene involving a duchess and her husband's groom that she didn't hear Hart enter until he was standing directly behind her chair. "Rousseau," he said, and she nearly fell off her seat. "Bold choice for morning reading." Haley slammed the book shut, but the damage was done. Hart had definitely seen which page she was on, judging by the almost smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "I thought it was philosophy," she lied badly. "It is, of a sort." He moved around her chair, settling into the one opposite with the kind of fluid grace that made her wonder about his past. Men didn't move like that from sitting in railway offices. "Tell me, Miss Fox, what do you think of Rousseau's argument that civilization corrupts man's natural goodness?" "I think it's convenient philosophy for people who want an excuse to behave badly." "Interesting. Most would say it's a critique of society's artificial constraints. Most haven't been to 2 finishing schools and watched supposedly civilized people behave like animals the moment they think no one important is watching." Haley leaned back, meeting his gaze. "People aren't naturally good or bad. They're naturally selfish. Civilization just teaches us which selfishness is acceptable and which gets you expelled." Hart laughed, actually laughed, a sound like distant thunder. "You speak from experience, I take it?" "The first school expelled me for pointing out that the headmistress's charity donations were considerably smaller than the amount she spent on her jewelry collection. The second expelled me for suggesting that perhaps teaching young women to be decorative and silent wasn't actually preparing them for anything except disappointment. And yet here you are, learning watercolors. Here I am, learning to pretend I care about watercolors. There's a difference." She straightened in her chair. "Why did you really bring me here? And don't say it's to save me from myself. You don't strike me as the altruistic type." Hart was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. Outside, rain battered the windows like it was trying to get in, or perhaps warning them not to get out. "Your father owed me money when he died," Hart said finally. "A considerable sum. I could have claimed it from his estate, taken what little was left and scattered you to whatever fate awaited. But I didn't." "Why not?" "Because he asked me not to. In a letter, written 3 days before the fever took him. He knew he was dying, knew what would happen to you afterward." Hart's voice had gone flat, emotionless. "He begged me. And your father was not a man who begged, to give you a chance he'd never had, to teach you that there were other ways to live besides burning bright and dying young." Haley felt something crack in her chest. "He never told me he'd written to you." "He never told you a lot of things. That was always Edmund's problem. He loved you desperately, but he loved his pride more." Hart stood, walked to the window, presented her with his back. "I made him a promise. I'm trying to keep it. But I can't do that if you fight me at every turn. I don't need saving. Everyone needs saving, Miss Fox. The trick is admitting it before you're already drowning." He left her there, alone with Rousseau and the rain, and a grief she hadn't known she was still carrying. Her father had begged for her, had set aside his precious pride long enough to ask the one man he'd once called friend to catch her when she fell. The revelation sat in her stomach like a stone. A week later, Haley discovered the locked drawer in Hart's study. She hadn't meant to snoop, or rather, she'd meant to snoop, but hadn't expected to find anything interesting. Hart struck her as the type to keep his secrets in plain sight, wrapped in such obvious propriety that no one would think to question them. But the drawer was locked, and locked things begged to be opened. The hairpin technique took 3 minutes. The contents took considerably longer to process. Marriage contracts. Her name in neat legal script, paired with Lord Alderton's. Terms and conditions, monetary exchanges, timelines. Everything arranged, everything decided, everything except her consent. Haley's hands shook as she read through the papers. Lord Alderton was 60 if he was a day, a railroad magnate with political aspirations and a reputation for cruelty that even London society found difficult to ignore. The sum being offered to Hart was staggering, enough to fund a small army or buy a significant portion of Parliament. The contract was dated 3 weeks after her arrival. Hart had known, had been planning this, had been playing the concerned uncle while negotiating her sale like she was livestock. She carefully photographed each page in her memory, returned everything exactly as she'd found it, relocked the drawer. Then she walked calmly to her room, closed the door, and let herself feel the full weight of betrayal. That night at dinner, she was perfect. Polite conversation, proper posture, no mud-stained rebellion. Hart looked surprised, but pleased, probably congratulating himself on finally breaking through her defenses. "You seem different tonight," he observed, pouring wine. "I've been thinking about what you said, about survival." Haley smiled sweetly. "You're right, of course. Fighting you is pointless when cooperation would be so much more beneficial for everyone involved." Something flickered across his face. Suspicion, maybe, or disappointment. "That's quite a change of heart." "I'm adaptable. It's one of my lesser-known talents." She took a delicate sip of wine. "Tell me about your business ventures. I've always been fascinated by commerce, but Father never explained the details. He said women didn't have the head for it." It was a calculated risk, appealing to Hart's ego while simultaneously insulting her father. But it worked. Hart spent the next hour explaining railway speculation, investment strategies, political maneuvering. And while he talked, Haley listened and learned and planned. If he wanted to sell her, he'd have to catch her first, and Haley Fox had no intention of being caught. The village was 3 miles from the house, reachable by a path through the woods that Mrs. Carmody had mentioned during one of their increasingly friendly conversations. Haley made the walk on a Tuesday morning, telling Hart she was sketching botanical specimens for her nature studies. She was actually meeting with a solicitor. Mr. Grayford's office was above a bakery, reached by narrow stairs that smelled of yeast and opportunity. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with ink-stained fingers and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Miss Fox?" He stood when she entered, gesturing to a chair that had seen better decades. "I received your note. You said it was urgent?" Haley laid out the situation with clinical precision. The marriage contract, the timeline, Hart's guardianship. She left out the complicated feelings, the moments when Hart had seemed almost human, the way he'd removed the lock from her door. Grayford listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. "The problem," he said finally, "is that your uncle is technically within his rights. As your father's executor and your closest living relative, he has considerable authority over your future until you reach 25 or marry." "So I have no recourse? I'm just property to be traded?" I didn't say that. Grayford pulled out a legal tome, flipped through pages worn soft with use. There are complications. If you can prove he's acting against your interests, specifically if the marriage would put you in danger, you might appeal to the courts. But you'd need evidence, and you'd need funds for legal fees. I have neither. Then you need to acquire both. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. There's another option, more radical, considerably riskier. If you could demonstrate financial independence, secure employment, establish residency elsewhere, you might argue for emancipation from his guardianship. It's rare, almost unheard of for women of your class, but not impossible. Employment. Haley nearly laughed. What could she do? She'd been trained for nothing except looking ornamental and making decent conversation. The skills that might actually prove useful, picking locks, reading people, calling out hypocrisy, weren't exactly marketable. I'll figure something out, she said, standing. Thank you for your time, Mr. Grayford. Miss Fox. He stopped her at the door. Be careful. Men like your uncle didn't become powerful by being careless. If he discovers you're plotting against him, then I'll have to make sure he doesn't discover it. She made it back to the house by lunch, her sketchbook filled with hasty drawings of flowers she couldn't name. Hart was in his study, door closed, and didn't emerge until dinner. Productive morning? He asked, too casually. Very. I'm developing quite the talent for roses. Roses. His eyes were unreadable. How appropriate. Beautiful, admired, and absolutely covered in thorns. Is that a compliment or a warning? With you, Miss Fox, it's impossible to tell the difference. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Carmody. The housekeeper found Haley in the garden 2 weeks later, sketching real flowers this time because the lie had to be maintained. She sat down heavily on the bench beside her, groaning like her bones hurt. Getting old's a misery, she announced. Everything aches, everything sags, and the only thing that improves with age is my ability to not care what people think. Sounds liberating. It is. Which is why I'm going to tell you something I shouldn't. Mrs. Carmody fixed her with a stare that could strip paint. The master's not selling you to Lord Alderton. Haley's pencil stopped mid-stroke. What? I know you found the contracts. Saw you coming out of his study that day, all pale and shaky. Figured you'd pieced it together. The older woman sighed. But you pieced it wrong, child. Those contracts aren't what you think. They have my name on them. Terms. Money exchanging hands. Aye, they do, because the master's buying you out of them, not into them. Mrs. Carmody pulled a folded paper from her apron. Found this in his wastepaper basket. He never throws away important things, but he'd been drinking that night, got careless. The paper was a draft letter to Lord Alderton, refusing the marriage proposal, apparently the third such refusal, judging by the frustrated tone. Hart was offering to pay double the contracted sum to dissolve the arrangement permanently. I don't understand, Haley whispered. Lord Alderton approached the master months ago before you even arrived. Had some hold over him, something from their business dealings in the East. Used it to force an agreement, a contract that said if Hart ever became your guardian, the marriage would proceed. Mrs. Carmody's voice gentled. The master's been trying to find a way out of it since the day your father died. That's why he brought you here, why he's been trying to tame you, not to make you marriageable, but to buy time while he figures out how to break an unbreakable contract. The world tilted sideways. Haley gripped the bench, trying to process this complete inversion of everything she'd believed. Why wouldn't he just tell me? Pride, probably. Or maybe he thought you'd do something reckless if you knew how much danger you were actually in. Mrs. Carmody stood, joints creaking. Lord Alderton's not a patient man, Miss Fox, and he's not the type to accept rejection gracefully. Whatever the master's planning, he's running out of time. Thought you should know that before you do something you can't take back. She left Haley alone with her flowers and her completely reorganized understanding of reality. Hart wasn't her enemy. He was her protection, and she'd been fighting him at every turn. Haley found Hart in the library that night, surrounded by papers and looking like he hadn't slept in days. The fire had burned down to embers, casting shadows across his face that made him look older, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "I know," she said from the doorway. He looked up slowly, comprehension dawning in his eyes. "Mrs. Carmody? She's surprisingly loyal to you, or possibly just enjoys meddling in dramatic situations. Hard to tell." Haley moved into the room, each step feeling weighted with consequences. "Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me?" Hart leaned back, studying her. "You'd already decided I was the villain of this story. Anything I said would have sounded like manipulation." "That's a coward's excuse." "Perhaps. Or perhaps I thought you had enough to worry about without adding my failures to the list." He gestured to the papers. "Lord Alderton's getting impatient. He's threatening to invoke the contract's penalty clause, which would essentially bankrupt me and leave you with no protection whatsoever. So let him. Bankruptcy isn't death." "No, but what comes after might be. Alderton doesn't just want a wife, Haley. He wants someone he can control completely, someone whose spirit he can break in service of his political ambitions. He told me once that women were most useful when they'd forgotten how to say no." Hart's voice had gone cold with fury. "I will burn this house down before I let him have you." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Haley felt something shift in her chest, something that had been carefully locked away since her father's death. "Then let me help," she said quietly. "Stop trying to protect me by keeping me ignorant. Let me fight beside you instead of against you." Hart was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded, reaching for a document from his pile. "There might be a way. It's risky, possibly illegal, and definitely not something a gentleman would ask of his niece." "Good thing I'm not interested in gentlemen, then." He almost smiled. "Alderton's hold over me comes from a business deal in Shanghai. Imports that weren't entirely legal, though they weren't entirely illegal either. He has documentation that could ruin my reputation, possibly land me in prison. But if we could prove that documentation was forged..." "You need evidence of forgery." "I need access to his private study in Richmond, where he keeps his insurance policies against people like me. It would require breaking into his house, stealing documents, and not getting caught. I've picked every lock in this house for practice. How different could his be?" Hart stared at her, something like awe crossing his face. "You're serious?" "I'm desperate. There's a difference." Haley moved closer, leaning against the desk. "Also, I'm extremely good at being underestimated. It's my most useful talent. This isn't a game, Haley. If Alderton catches you, then you'll have to rescue me. Isn't that what you've been trying to do all along?" She held his gaze, feeling the electric charge of shared purpose. "Besides, I have a personal investment in this now. He wants to break me. I want to break him first." "You're your father's daughter," Hart said softly, but it didn't sound like an insult anymore. "And you're more than you pretend to be." Haley straightened. "So stop pretending, and let's destroy this man properly." Lord Alderton's Richmond estate was hosting a dinner party, the perfect cover for what Hart politely called reconnaissance, and Haley more accurately termed burglary with style. She wore borrowed finery, her hair arranged in a way that made her look older, more sophisticated. Hart had obtained an invitation through a business associate who owed him favors, positioning them as distant cousins from out of town, distant enough to be unknown, connected enough to be allowed in. "Remember," Hart murmured as their carriage approached. "We're looking for filing cabinets marked with red seals. That's where he keeps his leverage documents. Get in, get what we need, get out." "You're very good at this. Should I be worried about your past?" "Extremely worried, but perhaps focus on the present first." The house was everything Haley despised about wealth: ostentatious, cold, designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Lord Alderton himself was holding court in the drawing room, a gray-haired man with calculating eyes and hands that moved when he talked like he was already grasping for things not yet his. He noticed Haley immediately. Of course he did. "And who is this lovely creature?" His gaze traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Miss Waverly," Hart said smoothly, using the false name they'd agreed upon. "My cousin, visiting from Savannah." "Ah, American. That explains the spirited look in her eyes." Alderton took her hand, held it too long. "You must let me show you the gardens later, Miss Waverly. I've recently installed quite the impressive fountain." "I'm sure it's very wet," Haley said, trying to sound vapid. Alderton laughed, still holding her hand. "And witty. How refreshing. Most young ladies these days are so terribly dull." Hart's jaw tightened, but he maintained his pleasant expression. "If you'll excuse us, Lord Alderton, I see some business associates I must greet." They moved through the party like dancers in a choreographed performance, Hart making conversation, drawing attention, while Haley slowly drifted toward the edges, memorizing the house's layout. The study would be upstairs, probably facing the front to oversee the grounds. Men like Alderton always wanted visual dominion over their territory. When Hart created a distraction, knocking over a tray of champagne with perfectly calculated clumsiness, Haley slipped away. The upstairs hall was deserted, lined with portraits of severe-looking men who all shared Alderton's predatory eyes. She found the study on her second try, slipped inside, closed the door with barely a whisper of sound. Red seals. She scanned the filing cabinets, found the marked drawer, pulled out her hairpins. The lock was more sophisticated than the ones at home, but the principle was the same. Pressure, patience, listening for the click. It gave way after 90 seconds. The files were meticulously organized, each one labeled with a name and date. She found Hart's quickly, thicker than most, suggesting Alderton considered him either particularly valuable or particularly dangerous. Probably both. The documents inside made her blood boil. Evidence of deals that had never happened, signatures that looked like Hart's but weren't quite right, dates that didn't align with actual events. Alderton had manufactured an entire criminal history, so detailed and convincing that any court would accept it as fact. And there, at the bottom, was the marriage contract, with a notation that made Haley's hands shake. "Subject shows spirit. Will require significant correction after acquisition." Correction. Like she was a manuscript with errors to be fixed. She was photographing the last page when the door opened. "Well, well." Lord Alderton stood in the doorway, blocking her exit. Behind him, two men, servants or guards, hard to tell the difference, filled the hallway. "Miss Waverly, or should I say Miss Fox? Did you really think I wouldn't recognize the girl I'd spent months researching?" Haley straightened, documents still in her hands. "I think you're a man who forges evidence and blackmails business partners. Whether you recognize me seems rather beside the point." Spirited indeed. Alderton stepped into the room, closing the door. "Hart chose well. I'll give him that, though I suspect he didn't expect you to actually attempt this little adventure. Where is he, by the way? Still downstairs, creating his pathetic distraction?" "Right here," Hart said from the window. He'd come up the trellis like some sort of storybook hero, was now perched on the windowsill with the kind of casual danger that suggested this wasn't his first time entering houses through unconventional methods. In his hand was a small pistol, not threatening exactly, but definitely present. "You're trespassing," Alderton said, though he'd gone slightly pale. "And you're a forger. I believe my crime's more socially acceptable." Hart swung into the room properly, positioning himself between Haley and the door. "Here's what's going to happen. Miss Fox is going to finish collecting evidence of your various felonies. Then we're going to leave, and you're going to dissolve our contract and never speak to either of us again. Or what? You'll shoot me? In my own home? In front of witnesses? No. I'll give these documents to the Times. Hart's smile was sharp as broken glass. Seems you've been blackmailing half of London's elite. I'm sure they'd be fascinated to learn about it. Some of them have considerably more violent approaches to conflict resolution than I do. Alderton's face went from pale to purple. You wouldn't dare. I absolutely would. The only reason I haven't already is that some of your victims are decent people who don't deserve the collateral damage. Hart gestured to Haley. But if you force my hand, I'll burn it all down and sort through the ashes later. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Alderton laughed, a bitter sound like breaking ice. You're in love with her, he said, and it wasn't a question. How absolutely perfect. Hart Fisher, the man who swore he'd never be weak enough to care about anyone, brought down by a girl with more courage than sense. I prefer to think of it as having my priorities properly arranged, Hart said quietly. Something you clearly never managed. Alderton looked at Haley, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not regret. He was too far gone for that. But recognition, perhaps, that he'd finally met someone he couldn't control. Take your evidence, he said finally. The contract is dissolved. But know this, Fisher. You've made an enemy today, a powerful one. I've had powerful enemies before. They're significantly less intimidating once you realize they bleed like everyone else. They left through the front door this time, walking calmly past confused guests and out into the night. Haley didn't start shaking until they were in the carriage, documents safely tucked into Hart's coat. That was insane, she said. That was necessary. Hart pulled off his gloves, revealing scratched hands from the trellis climb. Though I'll admit, my approach to conflict resolution may need some refinement. You brought a gun to a dinner party. I brought protection to a hostile situation. There's a difference. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. You were magnificent in there. Terrifying and brilliant and absolutely magnificent. I was stealing documents and nearly got us both killed. Like I said, magnificent. The word hung between them, charged with something that felt nothing like family affection. Haley became suddenly, intensely aware that they were alone in a dark carriage, that Hart's eyes were the color of smoke and storm clouds, that somewhere between taming and rebellion they'd crossed a line that had nothing to do with guardianship or duty. We should discuss what happens now, she said, because one of them had to be practical. Now I stop pretending to be your uncle, and you stop pretending you don't feel this too. He kissed her before she could respond. Or perhaps she kissed him, hard to tell when they met in the middle with equal desperation. It was nothing like the chaste, proper kisses she'd imagined love might involve. It was fire and frustration, and 3 months of battle finally finding better application. When they broke apart, Haley was breathless and furious, and entirely certain she'd just complicated her life beyond repair. We can't, she said, not moving away. We absolutely can't, Hart agreed, kissing her again. Society will... Damn society! I've spent 45 years caring what society thinks. It's exhausting and pointless, and I'm done. He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. But if you want to leave, if this is too much or too fast or just too complicated, I'll help you start a new life somewhere else. I'll fund it, support it, and never ask for anything in return. That's a terrible bargain. It's the only one I have. His thumb traced her jawline with devastating gentleness. I'm not your uncle, Haley. The relationship was distant enough to be nearly fictional, something your father exaggerated when he was desperate. I was his business partner, nothing more. But I understand if that distinction doesn't matter to you. Haley thought about the locked drawer, the dissolved contract, the way Hart had climbed through a window with a pistol because she'd been in danger. She thought about her father's letter, about promises made and kept, about the difference between taming and teaching. "Take me home," she said. "You are home." "I know. That's what I'm saying." She kissed him this time, slow and certain and entirely her own choice. "Take me home so we can figure out what comes next. Together." The carriage ride back was quiet, but the silence felt different now. Not the tense standoff of their early days, but something warmer, more promising. When they arrived, Hart helped her down with the kind of careful courtesy that suggested he was restraining himself considerably. "For the record," Haley said at the door, "I'm still difficult, stubborn, and likely to cause you considerable trouble. I wouldn't have it any other way." Hart smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "After all, someone has to keep me from getting too comfortable. Might as well be the woman I'm hopelessly in love with." "Hopelessly?" "Absolutely hopelessly. It's pathetic, really. You'd be embarrassed for me if you had any mercy." "Lucky for you, mercy was never my strong suit." She stood on her toes, kissed him once more. "But love might be, given the right motivation." She left him standing in the hall, climbed 3 flights of stairs to her room with the removed lock, and finally let herself smile. Tomorrow they'd face questions, complications, the inevitable scandal of Hart Fisher courting the niece who wasn't really his niece. But tonight, Haley Fox was free, not because she'd been tamed, but because she'd found someone wild enough to match her stride for stride, rebellion for rebellion, heart for heart. Some cages, it turned out, were actually doors. You just had to find someone willing to hand you the key. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as beautiful and intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. See you on the next one.